All right, so here is our next section in Unit 4, which is all about the difference quotient. Okay, now the difference quotient is this formula right here. So if we are given any function f of x, we can calculate this difference function by doing f of x plus h minus f of x all divided by h. So it's really just this big, ugly expression that we're trying to simplify, okay? Now, this will come in handy a lot whenever you move on to calculus, so it's good that you get experience with it here. Now, a lot of people are very overwhelmed by the ugliness of it, and so I'm going to teach it in a way that breaks it down into 3 steps. So step number 1 is going to be just to calculate f of x plus h, okay? Then step number 2 is going to be to subtract your original f of x function, okay? Then once you've done that, you should have this whole top piece simplified. So then our last step is going to be to divide the whole thing by h, okay? So let me show you what that looks like. Here they're giving us the function f of x equals negative 4x plus 6. Okay, and we want to calculate this difference quotient. So the first thing I need to know is this piece. What is f of x plus h? So I'm going to go ahead and just write here f of x plus h. Now, remember when we're doing functions, whatever is inside these parentheses is what's going to get plugged in for x. So since I have a quantity inside the parentheses, that whole quantity gets plugged in for x. So this function says to do negative 4 times my input and subtract 6. So I'm going to do negative 4 times that quantity input and subtract 6. Okay, and then I just need to simplify it a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and distribute this negative 4. So I get negative 4x minus 4h minus 6. Okay, so what I've done, I can't do anything else, there's no like terms. So what I've done is I've figured out what this first little piece equals. Okay, now I want to do the second part, which is to subtract my original function. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and write out, we have f of x plus h minus f of x. Okay, this is my second step. So this first part is what we just did, right? So I'm going to go ahead and write that in. For this first part, we got negative 4x minus 4h minus 6. And now this new part says to subtract my original f of x function. So I'm going to subtract my original function, which is negative 4x minus 6. Now, because I have 2 terms here, I want to make sure I put it in parentheses because I'm subtracting both of them, not just the first one. Okay, so the piece that I just did in step 1, and now step 2 is to subtract my original function. Okay, now when I subtract that original, all it's going to do is change the signs, right, of those terms in the parentheses. So I'll get negative 4x minus 4h minus 6. When I distribute that negative, I'm going to end up with a positive 4x and a positive 6. Okay, now you should always have something that simplifies at this step. Always, always, always. Notice I have a positive 4x and a negative 4x. Okay, so those are opposites. Those combine to 0. And I have a positive and negative 6. Okay, so what I ended up with from this step was just negative 4h. Okay, so that was step 2. Okay, we first calculated this, then we subtracted our original. So my whole top piece here is equal to negative 4h. Now the last thing I have to do is just divide by h. So I'm going to go ahead and write it. We have f of x plus h minus f of x all over h. And we just learned from the last step that this whole top part is just equal to negative 4h. So negative 4h divided by the h I have on the bottom actually allows me to cancel these h's, right? So I end up with negative 4. Okay, not too bad, maybe. Kind of ugly, but can be broken down. All right, let me do one more for y'all. And I'm going to go ahead and write my difference quotient down here just so that I have it for reference. So I'm going to go ahead and say, now for this one, notice we're using g of x. So the f f's here are just going to be g's. So I'm going to go ahead and write it with g's. So I have g of x plus h minus g of x all over h. Okay, and I'm just rewriting it down here so I can scoop my paper up so y'all can see what I'm writing. All right, so step one, remember, is just to simplify this first piece. So if I want to do f of x plus h, that means everywhere I see an x in my original function, I'm going to plug in this ugly quantity. Okay, so ugly quantity goes in for x. So this function says to do -2 times my input squared. So I'm going to do -2 times ugly quantity squared. And then it says to do -3 times my input. So -3 times ugly quantity. And then add 1. So add 1. Okay. So now I need to simplify this mess. Now, I cannot just square each piece. This is the biggest mistake I see everybody make. You can't change this into x squared plus h squared. Okay. When you have a squared quantity, that means you have 2 copies of that quantity. Okay. So you have to write it out so that you can distribute it. Now I'm going to go ahead and simplify this next piece by just distributing that -3 in. So I get -3x minus 3h plus 1. Okay. So I need to go ahead and distribute this out. I'm just going to ignore the -2 for now, and I want to figure out what this equals. And then once I know what this equals, then I'll distribute in that -2. So x times x gives me x squared. X times h gives me xh. H times x also gives me xh, and h times h gives me h squared. Okay, so all I did was FOIL out these 2 little quantities. Now notice it's still being multiplied by a -2. So I still need to have parentheses around that with a -2 on it. And I'm just going to go and write in my other terms here. -3x minus 3h plus 1. Okay. So now I need to distribute that -2 to all of these terms. So that's going to give me -2x squared minus 2xh minus 2xh minus 2h squared minus 3x minus 3h plus 1. Whew, right? All right, so we have it all distributed out, and now we can combine like terms. Okay, so when I'm looking through here, do I have anything that I can combine? I feel like the only thing that I can combine are my xh terms, right? I have a -2xh and a -2h xh. So this gives me -2x squared minus 4xh when I combine those two, minus h squared minus 3x minus 3h plus 1. Okay. All right. So that was my first step. I know it was ugly and I'm sorry, but that was just calculating this first one. Oops, and I didn't need to write an f here because we're using the g function. So when I plug in x plus h into my g function, I'm basically plugging in this ugly quantity everywhere I have an x in my original function, right? And then just simplifying it all out. So this is what I ended up with. Okay, so that was step 1. Step 2 is now to go ahead and subtract off my original function. So I'm going to go ahead and write this out. So this gives me g of x plus h minus g of x. Okay, so this says to do the answer that I just got and subtract my original function. So I'm going to write in this big ugly answer that I just got, which is -2x squared minus 4xh minus 2h squared minus 3x minus 3h plus 1. Okay, that's the answer I got from the last step. Now I'm going to subtract my original function. So I put my subtraction. Because my original function has more than one term, make sure you put parentheses around it. Okay, so I'm subtracting -2x squared minus 3x plus 1. Okay, so now I just need to simplify this, and the only thing I can do is distribute this negative and then see if I can combine some like terms. Okay, so I still have -2x squared minus 4xh minus 2h squared minus 3x minus 3h plus 1. And then when I distribute that negative, that creates a positive 2x squared, a positive 3x, and a negative 1. Okay? So now that I've got it all written out, some things should start canceling. You should always have stuff cancel at this step. So I have a positive and negative 2x squared, so those will cancel. I have a positive and a negative 3x, so those should cancel. And I have a positive and a negative 1, so those should cancel. Okay, so all I should be left with is my negative 4xh term, my negative 2h squared term, and my negative 3h term. Okay, so this leaves me with negative 4xh minus 2h squared minus 3h. Okay, and none of these are like terms, so I just leave it written like that. All right, so we completed step 2. We plugged in x plus h into our original. Now we have subtracted off our original. So we know this whole top part is equal to this, right? Now the third step is just to divide it all by h. So I'm going to go ahead and write it out. G of x plus h minus g of x all over h. Okay, so I'm going to take the answer that I got from my last step, which is negative 4xh minus 2h squared minus 3h, and I'm going to divide it all by h. Now we get really excited because there's h's on top and bottom, but I don't want you to just like mark one off. Okay, the only way that you can reduce this h away is if you can reduce it from every single term. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just write it out as if I'm factoring out an h from the top. Okay, so if I take an h out of this first term, I'll be left with negative 4x. When I take an h out of the second term, I'll be left with negative 2h. And when I take an h out of the last term, I'll be left with negative 3. Okay, and that's all over h. So it's just a good habit to get into of writing that h factored out, because then you can see that you're actually allowed to cancel it. Okay, when people try to cancel their h at this step, a lot of mistakes get made because either they just cancel it with one or they forget to cancel it with every single one. So it's a good habit just to get used to taking that h out like a greatest common factor and then reducing it. Okay, so what I end up being left with is just this piece here on top, which is negative 4x minus 2h minus 3. And we just leave it like that. Okay, so when you work these different quotient product or difference quotient problems, I encourage you to do it in this 3-step process versus trying to plug everything into this and making it nasty. Okay, simplify your function evaluated at x plus h, then whatever that equals, then subtract the original function. Be sure to use parentheses. Then whatever that whole top part equals, then divide off your h. Okay, all right, so there are 2 for you to try on the next page. So go ahead and pause the video, work those out, and then whenever you're ready to check yourself or if you get stuck, go ahead and play the video and we'll see how you did. All right, so let's go ahead and look at this first one. When we plug in our quantity x plus h, our function says to multiply it by 5 and add 7. So you need to distribute the 5 to both terms of that quantity and then add 7. Okay. Then our next step is to take that answer and subtract our original, right? So when we take this answer, we have it written here, and we subtract our original, make sure you put parentheses around it. That way when you distribute this negative, they both become negative, and you should be able to cancel your 5x's and your 7's, which leaves you with just 5h. So that way when you do your last step, the whole top part that you just discovered in the last step is 5h, and when we divide it by h, we can cancel those to just get 5. Okay, hopefully we're okay on that one. Let's go ahead and look at number 2. Number 2 is a little bit longer, right? Oops, I can't get rid of this glare. We'll deal with that when we get there. Okay, so first thing we do is we calculate h of x plus h. So we're putting that quantity x plus h everywhere we see an x in our original. Okay, so we're going to do 2 times the quantity x plus h squared plus x plus h plus 2. Now, because there's nothing going on outside of these parentheses, we can just drop them. Okay. However, over here, when we have a squared quantity, we have to write that out as the quantity times itself. So we want to go ahead and FOIL that x plus h times x plus h, which I did here below. Okay, and then notice it's still being multiplied by that 2. Okay, so make sure you don't drop those parentheses until you've distributed that 2 through. Okay, so that gives us 2x squared plus 2xh plus 2xh plus 2x squared plus my x and h and 2 that I had on the end. Okay, so when you combine your like terms, which is just your 2xh terms, you'll get 4xh. Okay, so that was kind of a long first step. Now that we have that first step, now we're going to subtract our original. Okay, so we take what we got from that first step, bring it down here, and then we subtract our original, always with putting parentheses around the original. That way we distribute this negative to each piece. So all 3 terms become negative, and all 3 terms should cancel with their opposites. Okay, that's going to leave us with 4xh plus 2h squared plus h, and then our third and final step is just to divide that by h. Okay, now again, good habit to first factor out the h off the top. So when we factor out an h, we're left with 4x plus 2h plus 1, and then our h's will cancel. So we're left with just that. Okay, all right, so that is the end of this section. Super short and sweet. So you should now be able to complete the difference quotients section on your Knewton assignments. And if you have any questions or need any help, please let me know.